grateful for people giving time to this.
Amazing.
Brennan, that's a great way to start office hours, with a word of gratitude. We are live on Facebook and I believe live on our Zoom webinar as well. So welcome to those of you who are joining us, whether that be on Facebook or on Zoom. We are so grateful that you're with us. Grateful. We were just grateful for our guests who have been with us in the past. And today, we are joined by the Dr. Roger Nam, who is a new professor of Old Testament Hebrew Bible at Emory University and Candler School of Theology, a place that Brennan and I happen to know fairly well. But Roger has moved just to Atlanta from the promised land of the Pacific Northwest, and so he's adjusting to, I think he said sweet tea and humidity, but no. So my name is Chris Holmes. I'm the scholar in residence at First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta, and joined also by Dr. Brennan Breed, who is Associate Professor of Old Testament at Columbia Seminary. And today we are talking about Ruth chapter 2. But first, let us just again say, Roger, thank you for joining us and for being a part of this discussion.
It's a pleasure. Quite great to be here and in the South.
That's right.
Nice. Well, Roger, thanks again so much for joining us, bringing your expertise in all things Old Testament. And let me just ask you, we usually ask people right off the bat, just to help us out and give us a bit of your hermeneutical lens or your assumptions that you bring with you to the biblical text, just to give us some flavor of your particular insights or your particular way that you approach the biblical text. And I know your research is broadly arrayed in many different fields, from Persian period to economics of the biblical text. But if you're going to kind of sum it up for, say, divinity students at your school in just a few minutes, what do you bring with you to the text consciously?
Great. Well, thank you for having me. And Brennan, you didn't mention really important thing about us, that we had this epic night 5 years ago in Seoul, Korea. When I was on sabbatical, you were there doing some work for Columbia, and we went and got some fried chicken, some Korean fried chicken. We saw a 4D movie, and I think that we have to replicate that now that I'm in Atlanta. That's right.
So I'm going to do the 4D movie experience. Like my chair will move as we talk about the Book of Ruth, like we're working in the field or something, that was a really fun night. And actually I've not seen 4D movie theaters here in the States. Maybe they exist, but not in Atlanta. So we'll have to go back to Seoul. Yeah, we'll have to do that. Yeah. What if we do a joint trip, right? Columbia and Candler, right? Yeah.
For sure. It sounds, Chris.
Yeah, hey, I think I need to bring some people from First Press for no other reason than the fried chicken. So let's make it happen. It can be a 3-institution trip. It'll be great.
That's good.
Watch that latest Terminator movie. Or
we watched Terminator in 4D.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that prompt. I'm a professor of biblical studies at Emory and Candler, and in terms of a hermeneutical lens, I can't remember who said this. Maybe one of you guys know. But I remember sitting at the SBL and someone was quoting, the Bible is a cross-cultural document. And so in terms of an approach, you want to recognize the distance you have from the Bible culturally and get as close as possible to that culture to kind of think about interpretation. And that'd be one very broad aspect. The second aspect is the idea of self-exegesis, that we all have our frames by which we interpret the Bible. The Bible's nothing without a reader. And the reader has certain frames and experiences and values and traditions that will all filter the interpretation of that text. So I think, one, you need to be aware of the frames that you carry as a reader, your own history, your own identity. And the second part, I think it's important to do what you're doing now and modeling right now, reading the Bible in community, because someone next to you can have a completely different frame, which will expand and enliven and sharpen and create a different interpretation that can interact with yours. So those are two aspects in terms of, reading the Bible, my hermeneutical lens, I think are very important for first-year students to kind of understand.
Thanks. That's fantastic. And one other question we usually ask is, like, what has been occupying your scholarly attention recently? So we could talk about Ezra, Nehemiah, and Persian period stuff, but also if there's other things that are kind of coming into your view. We talked a few years ago about thinking about ethnicity and migration and change, but I gotta admit, I don't know if there's something else on the radar now for you.
Well, I'm doing a commentary right now, and so that's kind of occupying all my time. And so I'm doing a commentary for Ezra Nehemiah, and that approach is what makes it, I think my take on this, there are three aspects. Ezra Nehemiah has a lot of economic information, and so I'm trying to look at some of the economic texts and how they kind of play into positions of power, theology there, especially things like Nehemiah 5. Also, another aspect that I think is really important is the reception. And to be super honest, like, this is the truth. When I wrote the proposal, Brennan, I mentioned you because of the importance of reception and like what you did with the OTL Daniel with Carol Neeson, that there is such a rich, broad reception, which helps us understand different communities and how they had their frames for reading the text, and to go all the way up to even medieval periods of different receptions of Ezra Nehemiah. And the third part, which I think we might talk about a little bit today, is I'm trying to argue that the repatriation, the return migration back to Judah, is a totalizing immigration experience. And by that, I mean you're displaced, and you're displaced in a way that affects everything. And so one example of that hermeneutical principle, when I say totalizing language or financial security, your ideas of identity and who you are, the way you raise your kid, those all appear in Ezra Nehemiah. And so I think that's a very important aspect that I want to draw out more in my interpretation.
That's cool. I'll really be looking forward to it, especially the parts where you mentioned me. No, I'm just kidding. But no, I mean, but seriously though, that issue of reception, we haven't talked about that much in office hours, but just the idea, right, of reception history being the idea that what's happened with the text is also of interest and is an important part of actually studying the text itself. So what can this text really do? Mm-hmm. It's interesting to see, Gail Yee has this fantastic article on Ruth where she shows in global biblical interpretation, I mean, how many different interpretations of the Book of Ruth there are. And Jennifer Kusit has a good recent book on kind of the history of interpretation of Ruth in that way, which, yeah, it's fascinating to see how this text comes alive in different contexts. But yeah, I'd love to hear too, I mean, from your perspective too, how this kind of sounds and feels. And you know, there's one that an article that we recommended this week from Daniel Smith Christopher, or no, I'm sorry, from M. Daniel Carroll R. That's right. Daniel Smith Christopher was last time. Yeah, M. Daniel Carroll R. On just the experience of kind of the assimilation, the pressure on assimilation that immigrant communities often feel, and kind of the way that feels and things. So, and that's so it's such a live topic in today's world too. But we can see from Ruth that it's always been a live topic. The idea of movement, the movement of peoples, and the way that cultures either welcome or don't welcome, or the different kinds of welcome and integration, assimilation of the forces and pressures on people culturally can be. So we can see that, I think, at work in some of this text today. So I'm super fascinated, and you know, I can't wait for it to come out, the Ezra Nehemiah text. Yeah, I'll be first in line to buy it.
Yeah, so, I'm waiting too. I'm looking forward to. Like, I still have 3 more years before your friends are on me to get my manuscript.
Emailing every day, right? Yeah. Bill Brown and Carol Newsom, and Brent Strong is on the board, I think, too.
Those are the 3. Yeah.
Well, thanks again, and I appreciate it. Yeah.
Well, in terms of that idea, you know, I am grateful for, you know, one part about reception I think is really important, whether it's reception of Ruth or Daniel or Ezra Nehemiah, is, you know, in Christian faith, oftentimes we're so insular chronologically to our own narrative, our own conversion, and which is important. It shouldn't be, you know, minimized in any way, but we are in fact part of a really long chronology of faith that is passed down not through genetics and not through, but through actually a story and a message that's passed, and it crosses oceans. It crosses into different social contexts. And so it's really befitting of a Christian community to think richly about how the reception of a text like Ruth was received by, you know, a community under siege, or a community that's trying to forge some identity in the midst of some immigration crisis. And there's a great richness that kind of inclusive of our own faith that broadens our vision of what Christianity can be.
Yeah. So we are, as you know, Roger, we have been studying the Book of Ruth for 2 weeks now. We sort of started the first week with just a broad overview with Elaine James. And then last week we had Kathleen O'Connor to talk about Ruth 1. And so now we are in Ruth 2. And Ruth 2 opens with these two female protagonists, Ruth and Naomi, entering Bethlehem. And they're immediately, as Brennan points out, situated in relationship to two men, Elimelech and Boaz. And so why is it significant that they enter into the community in Bethlehem in this way, or with these relationships in mind?
Well, a couple of things with that. One, I think Ruth is an extremely playfully subversive text. And so, as we recall, Ruth 1 actually also begins with men. And it's not, in the days of the judges, it's not about Ruth. She's not mentioned, and she doesn't even say anything until later in the chapter. But it's about men, but they die. But that it was a reflex of being a deeply agrarian patriarchal culture where men had the access to the means of production. And that was usually some sort of land, some sort of house and field by which they can get sustenance. And so by the end of chapter 1, you've been introduced to this family through the men, through the patriarchs. They all die. You're left with, two Moabite women who are, a Moabite woman who's trying to return to Bethlehem, but it's pretty dire. You have, literally the most disenfranchised class in a foreign widowed woman coming to Bethlehem, and it looks pretty grim. And so by introducing with men, Elimelech and Boaz, you have some sort of kind of hint of maybe providence and sustenance, and it has to be through the male line. The access for women for sustenance really there was not a lot of option, and so I think this is part of the introduction. This is the financial redemption of Ruth.
Great. And I was telling Brennan before we got on that one of the things that throughout chapter 2 that I hope that y'all can help sort of tease out is it's sort of the narrative quality of this story is almost, it can sort of carry you away, and then there's all sorts of customs and practices that are under the surface that we may not miss. They're not, or that we may miss because that we sort of get caught up in the narrative and the events of the story. And so one of those is about Boaz and his identity. He's described as a worthy man. He's also described as a kinsman. And so I'm wondering if either of you want to sort of tease out what's going on with being a worthy man and or being a kinsman. What do we need to know? What does your very inferior New Testament scholar need to know from these brilliant Old Testament scholars?
You're being hard on yourself, Chris.
I just studied the appendix. It's so much easier.
It is only 40 pages of Greek, I'll be honest. Yeah, okay. But and so I'll kind of mention one thing that comes to mind. Maybe Brennan can follow. So the kinsman, that idea is someone within the family. And so this is going to gross out a lot of the listeners. But in antiquity, and in fact, most of human history, you married a distant relative. And let me assure you, your distant cousin is just as grossed out as you are at that fact. But you did that for financial reasons. The idea of romantic love, it was always there in literature, but in reality, so for example, my grandparents met each other on the day they married. And it was just it was an arrangement. And so you can suspend your judgment meter for a second. There is evidence that these arranged marriages are just as, satisfying and not satisfying as, marriages in which people fall in love. And part of the reason for that, I understand, is the expectations are really low compared to other marriages. But you did an arranged marriage because there was a reason you had to keep the wealth within the family. And so it was strategic, because if you further divide the ancestral lands, you get less and less and less and less. And so marriages were an economic function and arrangement. and is a way to maintain wealth in the family. And so the idea of a kinsman, the hope that was hinted in chapter 1 is for Ruth to marry someone else and to have children, namely sons, because sons are the ones that stayed in the household. That was the reality of agrarian patriarchal society. But being identified as a kinsman redeemer is the one that was close enough in the family that would permit a redemption or a marriage for Ruth. And then that would equate sustenance for her livelihood. And really the only way for women, especially a Moabite woman at that time. But Brennan, I'm sure you have some other thoughts on that.
Just the idea that this does entail some obligations, some societal kind of cultural obligation on Boaz too, like that he's got this kind of you can see this in the law of Moses, that there are these injunctions, and especially Deuteronomy, that like people who are even distant relatives do have some kind of obligation to make sure that their distant relatives are cared for, that they have access to something like land, the means of production, and food sustenance through sometimes marriage. There is this kind of a vague, distant obligation. But it's the fact that Ruth is a Moabite and that she is not technically related to Boaz anymore. I mean, the fact that like Naomi, I find it interesting that the phrase "my daughter" occurs twice in this chapter, once from Naomi and once from Boaz, both calling her my daughter, both kind of with Naomi kind of legitimately, but also kind of symbolically. We talked about in chapter 1 that there's this kind of covenant, your people are my people, and so on. That this kind of creation. I mean, this is Ruth signing on to the family, kind of creating a family really out of thin air, as Mark Smith has pointed out, like this, using this covenantal language. But so there's this perhaps tenuous sense of family and identity, but Ruth is being claimed in both way and by both people as a relationship, even if Boaz doesn't actually do anything about it. He gives her a little bit of something this chapter, but not his full obligations, as it were. I mean, I guess that tension builds as we go on throughout the story. But so there's that's interesting. I mean, and then just the man of valor thing, the Gibor Hayil in Hebrew, Gibor meaning can just mean a dude, but really meaning like a kind of someone of importance. So an important guy, and then that word that follows is Hayil, like a valor, a person of strength, some sort of power or virtue. Those are all kind of implied together, and that this word is used to refer to Ruth as well in this story.
Right.
And both if people are familiar with Proverbs 31, a woman of valor, or there's a lot of phrases used to describe that chapter, but that's the same terminology when we talk about chapter 3. We'll get more into, I think, that connection there. But that idea that that Boaz is being described first as this person of valor, but then that word will actually be used to describe Ruth as well. I think that'll pop back up in the story. But it's right. I did notice that, like, on rereading that verse 1 is totally disconnected from the rest of the, like, it got me thinking that Ruth and Naomi knew this, that the field that, it's a foreshadowing, but it's a subtle foreshadowing that I kind of overread the first, probably 50 times I read the story, as if I thought Ruth knew she was going to this field of this particular guy who was a kinsman to try to get him on her side. But it seems like it was all happened. It comes up as happenstance later, like it was this kind of chance thing. Anyway, so I'll just say that's some of my thoughts. But Roger, let me ask you another question, which might intersect with your work a bit, and there's this big debate about when Ruth was written, and we don't have to answer that question here. But there are a lot of conversations about how Ruth intersects with this larger world, which you are in the middle of researching right now, and that's the Persian period, the period after the return from the exile, and which links up to Ezra and Nehemiah. So if she's returning, Ruth is returning from Moab, or really kind of entering for the first time, Israel and Bethlehem, the area of Judah, from outside. In what ways would this connect, or would this intersect with some of the bigger conversations that are happening about identity, ethnicity, right, and so on, in that material that you're really working on right now? Right.
So a lot of people consider Ruth to be kind of a theological balance with Ezra and Nehemiah. So Ezra and Nehemiah is really very aggressive in what I would call their identity formation. And so part of the reason is, you see this obsession with exclusion and inclusion in Ezra. Like they literally are building a wall in Nehemiah. They have all these lists in like Ezra 2 and Nehemiah 7 of who's in and who's out. They are making injunctions against foreign women, including a Moabite, in places like Nehemiah 13. And whereas here it's kind of, it adds some theological tension when you have a Moabite woman who actually becomes in the line of David. And so I think what's happening in the Persian period, and again, I would say the repatriation frames everything, it's totalizing. And so you could just ask any immigrant family what, just questions on identity, and that will open up a whole world of kind of understanding what's going behind these different texts and why it's so emphasized that she was a Moabitess entering this culture. What do we know about the Persian period? We know it was very poor. We knew that it was a decimated population. And even though there's this great idea of returning to the old Jerusalem of Solomon and having temple worship, they came back and they were largely disappointed. And what's really parallel in social sciences is that's kind of mirrors a lot of voluntary immigration experiences. Forced displacement is a little bit different, but a voluntary immigration experience, and especially imagine a world without social media. And you're going to go to like America and it's going to be great. And there's going to be so much abundance and people are going to be nice and kind to the foreigners. And we're going to have all this access and right. And a lot of that is not false, but there's a buildup of expectation that in the many immigration experience leads to some disappointment when they get there. And that's magnified with repatriation. And so with the repatriation, you've lived there, you left, then you came back. And so you hear these stories, and the stories you tend to hear a certain perspective that's more glamorous than the way things were. And we know from, early on in Ezra, they return and actually the elders are weeping, but everyone else is like super excited because we have a temple. But the elders are the ones who remember how it used to really be. It's nothing like that. So I think Ruth kind of, for us, it helps us think through how do you treat the foreigner and how do you, how do you forge identity? We do also know that Moab was a distinct ethnic institute that had some crossovers. So, for example, a lot of the material culture is very similar to the archaeological material culture of Israel. They had Moabite language, which was distinct but similar. And one example is if, Brennan, all your first year Hebrew students, they could probably read Moabite by the end of the first year to some degree. But yet there are some distinguishing factors in the Moabite language, like the plural is a little bit different and stuff like that. So there's, they definitely have different identities. And so what happens when one identity crosses the other, and what is the obligation and the burden of the community when someone from that outsider perspective comes in? And Ezra Nehemiah has something very rigid, I would say, and Ruth is almost an antidote to that.
So, Roger, when you were talking, I just had this epiphany sort of question come up, and if we can't dwell on it, and the answer is we may not know, but when you're talking about proximity and distance, and in this migration period, like when I think about migration, I tend to filter it through like worldwide migration, and it's easy to sort of think about really significant cultural differences from moving into the U.S. or Canada or Europe from somewhere in Southeast Asia or in the continent of Africa, and so I wonder if there's anything to say about how we think about, if there's a spectrum of difference in migration and movement in the ancient world, how significant would it have been for moving from Moab to Israel? And also, footnote, I'm terrible at geography, so I have no idea, like, if that's like hundreds of miles, 2 miles, a couple blocks, but, just help us sort of understand how maybe our understandings of migration and those differences in movement maybe are similar or different from what Ruth and Naomi are going through.
Yeah, that's really a wonderful prompt. I think in certain ways it's closer and it's farther. Okay, so I'm going to say that like a good teacher. So it's closer. Nice. So Moab is literally next to Israel.
Okay.
So it's close, but you don't have modern transportation. You're not getting on a bus. You're probably not even getting on an animal to go there. You're probably walking this and doing this by foot. And it's something that even as you ask the question, I think through, when I did sabbatical in Korea, or when I moved to Atlanta with my family.
Yeah.
Like I basically get on the plane for 5 hours, but that, as I think of, that's a pretty meaningful 5 hours, to be on there and to leave a place that's been home for 12 years, much less 12 generations. It's a very thought-provoking. And so there's a lot of that time when you're walking from Moab to Bethlehem. You're also crossing the Jordan. You have obstacles. So there is a distinct marker, which is different from, say, like the Edomites, I would say. And you're also, but it's very close. And so the land of Moab, you will see a lot of similar features in much of the land of Judah in terms of that. And so it's closer and it's farther. Other thing that you could think through is, well, what do we know about Moab? Not a ton, but we know they worship a different god. Right. And so there's mention of Chemosh in a Moabite inscription, and Chemosh had a consort as well. And so that's polytheistic to a degree. And so you're introduced to a different way of worship. And that's kind of made very explicit in the declaration of Ruth, when she claims Naomi's God will be her own. And so that experience, even though it's so radically different in our conception, I think there is place for parallel without, flattening out the experience. When you are speaking a language and brought up on certain customs, then displaced into, whether voluntary or involuntary, to a completely different, that is a really jarring experience. And there are certain ideas that come up again and again, whether it's a repatriation or transcontinental or from Africa to Europe or something. Like, there's certain things. And one thing that comes up a lot is identity formation and how the identity formation changes over generations. And so with Ruth, she is being introduced to this place, and she is having an experience which is totally new, which is outlined a little bit in chapter 2. But it is something that I think has parallel today. And again, back to the earlier point, if you are not part of an immigration experience, it would do well to read the Bible with those who have, because they will surely help you understand this text in ways that you might not be able to see based on your own reading frame.
Yeah,
I feel like there's another kind of flip aspect of that for, like, when Christians, especially from a dominant culture. So, like, I'm a white cisgender male Christian in America. When people like me tend to read Ezra and Nehemiah, there tends to be this, outright condemnation of the protectionist or kind of defensiveness of the community about ethnicity, and about protecting their culture in a way, which I do think that the ends of Ezra and Nehemiah are ethically complex, are threatening the lives of women and children, and need to be critiqued. But at the same time, sometimes that critique comes pretty easily from Christians like me, men like me, white people like me, who are used to kind of our cult, like, of course I'm going to welcome people. Why would I not welcome people, right? There's this kind of too easy liberal critique, whereas communities that have been minoritized, who have been threatened, who are maybe have been dominated by another culture or another ethnicity and so on, might actually understand that impulse to protectiveness in a way that, like, I wouldn't ever understand. And oftentimes I think Christians think of the Ezra and Nehemiah, the conclusion of it, as particularly Jewish in an anti-Semitic way. That, like, this defines Judaism in some way as a insular, anti-foreign, or xenophobic religion that Jesus sets us free from in some way. But just to point out that I don't think Ruth is Ruth and Ezra and Nehemiah don't easily play those roles that I think a lot of interpreters want to play. But I don't know if you have any thoughts about that and how that might intersect with this.
You're absolutely right. And, maintain your identity and the pressure of assimilation, the maintenance of identity needs to be very aggressive and intentional. Otherwise you will assimilate. It happens in every, transmigrational culture. And so I don't like the ending of Nehemiah is theologically very troubling to me. I do think the repatriation gives me a frame by which I could understand the importance of that. And also, especially when it talks about, half the people speak Judean or Hebrew and half of them speak Ashdodite, probably Aramaic. I see that in my life. And so when my mom and dad came in the 60s, so my mom and dad came right after the quotas were lifted in 1965, and they immigrated to the States in 1967. My brother and I were born soon after that. And back then, and Brennan, you would not believe this, but I know that Korea was a super poor country in the early 70s. And so my father, with his broken English and his experience of racism, I would suspect in the 1970s, he made a determination that my kids are going to speak English perfectly. There's nothing for them in Korea, but they need to live a thriving life in America. And for that, they need to speak English perfectly. And so that is a moment of intentional identity decision, that he's going to go away from, at least in that aspect, the Koreanness of who we are and be American. And so we did Cub Scouts. I played Little League. We did all the American things that I think my dad thought would help us assimilate. And then there are also issues of conflict within that. Like there are times when we still went to a Korean church and, the foods that we ate, but it became obvious with what you get with any second generation family, that there is a disconnect between the first and second generation. So all the experts that do youth ministry, they say that the first to second generation for an immigrant family is like 2 generations, actually. It's like, it's that far removed and stuff. So I think I could appreciate the aggressive intent, although I want to say it still is very troubling, the end of Nehemiah. But I think those that have been in displaced communities can understand how important it is to deliberately, intentionally forge an identity. Otherwise, assimilation will be there. I will also say, there was an article, and people have recognized this, but Chris Jones wrote about this. Ezra has this really troubling theology of inclusion, exclusion. I think it needs to be read in light of repatriation and identity formation. But even within that, in Ezra 6:21, there's a notion that everyone of the nations who come to worship the Lord are invited for the Passover celebration. So in the middle of this like really sharp exclusionary ideology, you have like what anyone from the nations is welcome to celebrate the Passover with the community. And I think in many ways, maybe Ruth and Ezra and Nehemiah are not as contradictory as might initially be thought, but both present different parts of obligation when you are forming who you are, which is, I think in both, it's the same, someone who worships the Lord, and that will transcend the ethnic identity.
So you're saying, both of you are saying that maybe the Bible is a little more complicated than than we might see on first impression. Dang it, to you both. So I wanna think this is so rich, Roger. Thank you for sort of so seamlessly blending contemporary realities with biblical realities and sort of how they intersect. I'm wondering, so as we sort of turn our attention back to Ruth chapter 2, really after the setup, the rest of it is sort of this like elaborate dance of sorts between Boaz and Ruth. And it all has to do with, at least the beginning, with this concept of gleaning. And here, as you know, this is another place where I think we may not all know what that means. And so can you two talk to us about gleaning? And then maybe we can talk about the progression of Boaz and Ruth and their interaction in chapter 2 that then, leads into the reporting back to Naomi.
Yeah, so gleaning, you could also, and some people would translate that as gathering. And so one idea, and there's a precedent in Torah and in biblical law that you are not to thoroughly gather everything, and that afterwards you leave for those that don't have access to ancestral lands the opportunity to glean what is left over after the first harvest, so they can also have something to eat. And so in Ruth, it's assuming a socially embedded economy. And so so here's a little clue. Whenever it says money in the Old Testament, it actually doesn't mean money. Money doesn't even exist in the Old Testament. The first coins were there, in Judah beginning the late 5th century, but they were very exclusive. They were symbolic, and very few people think that money exists. And the way you did economic transactions is through socially embedded relationships. So this was part of that social net for people that lost, their access to kinship, whether it was through war or starvation. You did not have a patriarch in a patriarchal land. And so this was an act of charity that was obligated on the Israelites, mandated through biblical Torah, to make sure that those in marginalized social situations can glean so they can have some sustenance. So don't decimate the fields with your own harvest, but leave some for others. And that was kind of, that's definitely alluded to in Ruth 2. But Brennan, anything?
Yeah. I mean, just the idea. I think today a lot of Christians would think, or I've heard a lot of Christians say things like, well, the law can't force me to be charitable because otherwise it's not charity or something like this. But yeah, I mean, we do see that that there is a expectation, a cultural expectation, but also economic expectation, and a religious expectation, theological expectation, that you are going to take care of your neighbor. And so in that same kind of gleaning law we see in Leviticus 19, we also see, love your neighbor as yourself comes from Leviticus 19. Jesus quotes that. And then the gleaning law comes right after that. And then later on in the chapter, it even says in Leviticus 19, love the foreigner as yourself, the wandering alien. So this idea that we're supposed to care for those people who are in our geographic proximity, we're supposed to care for the people we can care for. And part of that is, to make sure that they are cared for and have enough food. And there's other verses in Leviticus 19 that have to do with paying people. If you have laborers who come to your field, you better pay them well and things like this. So that was all kind of embedded. I think, that's a great phrase, that socially embedded expectations. And so that also is interesting to me, because you have this embedded within this patriarchal system as well, where you have these relationships where in verse 2, Ruth is going to go to this field in order to glean, in order to gather up the excess food, which is expected for people to be able to survive on the margins. But also she wants to find favor. She wants to try to find someone who can bring her out of this situation of dire poverty and living at the margins and the extremes. And so, that word chen, like grace, or favor, or she wants somebody to look kindly on her and help her to change and transform her situation. So we see that too, that gleaning isn't quite enough. I don't think, to have a good life, but it's enough to survive, maybe.
Right, and that phrase, to find favor, it actually is connecting through all sorts of so it's a very common phrase, idiom in biblical text. It's used for most often God finding favor in some famous guy, whether it be Noah or Abraham or Moses. They're all people that find favor. You also have people finding favor in the eyes of other men, and so Joab would be an example. And you will have it also for Ruth and also for Esther. And what's different about them, they are finding favor in the eyes of other earthly men. And the finding favor, and this is why I think it's so subversive, because she is going to find favor, and she's declaring. So Ruth, when she's introduced in Ruth 1, she's a young widow and very, in a very impoverished situation. You develop some pity for her, but she has this really great declaration in Ruth 1, and those are the first words from her mouth. And then this tenacity to hold on to Naomi. And here in verse 2, you see that also reflected. I'll read from the NRSV, in whose sight I may find favor. And then later on, she repeats that a couple more times, that she has indeed found favor, which is kind of playful because she's acting surprised, but she kind of was determined in verse 2. And so that presents a real reversal of role from this marginalized, poor, foreign, young widow to be someone who's actually very strong, active, and goes to find favor for herself in the eyes of those who are empowered. So it kind of reverses the patriarchal frame in certain ways. She, Boaz is he's the one that kind of feels like has less agency in all this situation. He is acting in ways that I think Ruth would have predicted and wanted for herself. And that phrase is one way that I think that plays out when it's repeated a couple times more in chapter 2.
Yeah, and we'll see that in chapter 3 too, at the threshing floor, where she's taking matters into her own hands with Naomi's help. Yeah, so it is fascinating. You see these marginal women who would be assumed by the men of the story probably to have very little agency and industriousness, etc. But like Boaz seems to be very surprised by Ruth's by her ability to make things happen without the typical resources one would require to make sort of these things happen in the ancient world. Yeah, that is super cool. So in light of time, I'm just looking and realizing it's 10:10. We got some more things. We're on verse 2. But anyway,
we sort of bounce past verse 2 and then come back to it a couple times. So
we're doing great. We're doing real great here. Yeah, this feels a lot like one of my class sessions. So anyway. But yeah, but the story kind of progresses with Ruth stumbling into Boaz's field. It seems not by her own plan necessarily. At least that's the way that kind of by chance is kind of the way the story puts it. But so you get Boaz showing up. He's been away on business in Bethlehem or something. Shows up and greets people with "The Lord bless you," Yahweh's name used there. So he's a good Yahwist, right? I guess.
Highest God, right?
But so Boaz immediately notices Ruth and says, "Whose young woman is this?" And why would he, like, to whom? There's this kind of use of like a possessive almost. And what do you all make of that?
Yeah. I mean, it strikes me as that definitely struck me as well. This language of belonging, and the idea that, we see this in some New Testament texts and later texts that, unattached women were perceived to be as either dangerous or as particularly prone to danger, right? So they are either a threat or they're threatened to become victims. And that's the thing that stood out to me. But what about you, Roger?
Well, there's another playfulness happening in verse 5, because it's using the same word for the servant or overseer that it does for youth. It's using the word na'ar, and for Ruth it gets an effeminate. So na'ar is like a young boy, a young man, and na'ara is a young woman or a young girl, and they're using the same phrase. So within that, though, it has possession. So Boaz says to his na'ar, who's in charge of the reapers, to whom does this na'ara belong? And so lexically they're at the same, but Boaz places them like this. And so, because he is the one in charge of Ruth. And so that whole thing, the servant was, it is the same word, but it kind of reinforces it in verse 6. Not only is she a female, a young female, young woman, but she's also Moabite. And so it elicits some sort of pity or compassion. She came back with Naomi from the country of Moab, and presumably this is understood. You can imagine when someone goes and someone comes back, there's going to be surprise, and they find out about the widowhood and the death, and they're back and they are to be pitied. But it kind of sets up these different positions that are being overturned even within. And this is gender, this crosses ethnic identity, class. Yeah.
So, and then I think Elaine pointed this out in the first week, but I think she said, always be aware of when Ruth is described as Ruth and when Ruth is described as that Moabite woman, even in this text, we see that sort of when is she recognized in her particularity, and when is she just another foreigner in the narrative? And so we see that Naomi is named, but for the overseer, she sort of remains just one of those Moabites, right? Which stood out to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that is a really great detail, because I could see it right now in the narrative, that tool for the compiler of this to identify her as an other and to identify her just as Ruth.
Yeah. So I wonder, I know, again, we're sort of being mindful of time, and there's this multi-stage interaction between Boaz and Ruth after he finds out who she is. And I'm wondering, for both of you, there's 2 or 3 different interactions, but is there anything that really stood out to you two as you read this as, this is a really significant move on Ruth's part, or this is a really surprising move on Boaz's part? What about this sort of narrative interaction is significant for the narrative sort of moving forward?
I've got a quick thing, and that's this is pointed out by Todd Linnefelt, but other folks who have worked on kind of the narrative stuff, but mentioning that the dialogue is where you really get insight into the kind of in ancient Israelite literature. Dialogue gives you insight into the characters' kind of thoughts, feelings, emotions, sometimes poetry as well when they break into poetry, as we mentioned before. But in Ruth 2:7, the overseer sort of stumbles over his words. Now, maybe this is like a bad text or something, but we have no textual evidence that this is like been corrupted over the years by bad copies. But it seems like, he's kind of stumbling at the end of his words. He doesn't really quite know what to say. And then in verse 8, Boaz says, runs to her, it seems like immediately goes to Ruth and says, don't leave. And so folks have pointed out that this probably suggests that Ruth is running away from the, but Ruth is about to leave the field because of something that's happened. And then there's several different mentions of basically sexual harassment, of
violence,
something,
right? Potential violence.
either sexual harassment, sexual abuse, that there are young men in the fields that take advantage of these young women or women of any age who are coming to these fields in order, like kind of looking for food. So these marginal women would probably not have the same access to justice or to avengers or, these redeemers, people who would be in position of authority to stand up for them, represent them. And this also might be related to the idea that God seems to take this role in the law of Moses, that God seems to be this Goel, the redeemer of the orphan, the widow, the poor, and so on, the alien, the wandering alien. But so here, there's like no one to stand up for her, but Boaz ends up doing that, maybe realizing his responsibility, that he's supposed to, he has to go tell these young men a couple times, hands off, right? Don't touch her. Protect her. He tells the overseer, he tells, and so there's this reinforcement throughout the story. It's done very subtly. It's not clear, but the suggestion seems to be from the overseer's stumbling words, from Boaz's quick response, and then his orders that he gives several times in view of everyone in the field, hands off. And then he privileges her by giving her more or excess food that she's supposed to get. That seems maybe that there's this kind of recognition of stature that's supposed to protect her in some way, although may have made her a target too. But all to say, that's kind of that strikes me as something kind of interesting in the way this story unfolds.
Yeah, I think that's very like, I have ordered the young men not to bother you, and Ruth 2:9 implies something's going on in offering his protection. And this goes also back to finding favor. You find favor from God in the famous narratives in the Bible. And so it's introducing certainly the idea that Ruth is finding favor in the eyes of God, but through Boaz is the person to present. And that's made pretty explicit. And, there is the idea of verse 12, when it says, may the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. And so the idea of wings is, of course, metaphorical for God. But in chapter 3,
right,
Ruth says, spread your wing over me. It's the same word. And by the way, just thank you for not inviting me for Ruth chapter 3. I don't know. I'm just glad not to be on Facebook Live talking about that, because I read that.
A spicy story.
Goodness. Thank you for not inviting me for that week.
Yeah. No, that's great. Yeah, I noticed in the study notes that the God's wings is the same word as cloak translated in chapter. It's translated as cloak in chapter 3, and it denotes protection and such. I was struck by the meal. I don't know, and maybe it's just because meals figure so prominently in the Gospels, particularly the Gospel of Luke, that this, they break bread and they dip it in sour wine. I am sure the early Christian fathers just love this text as a sort of prototype for communion and for as we celebrate World Communion today. But there's an intimacy here, and it seems like Boaz really doesn't need to do this, right? I mean, Boaz could have just left with, "Hey, I'm going to make sure that my slaves don't mess with you in the fields," or he could have said, "I'm going to leave a little bit behind for you." But I think about the intimacy that goes into inviting somebody experiencing poverty, experiencing homelessness into your home, into your meal, and just that struck me as a really significant gesture in the narrative. And I don't know if I'm overreading it, if I'm overplaying my cards, but it just seems like that she is really welcome into his household in this ancient understanding of household, where it wasn't just your genetic children or your genetic family, it was also all of your slaves, your householders who were under the protection of your house. And in a really significant way, Boaz is already moving her into the household even before chapter 3.
Yeah, I think one way I approach this is, remember, the whole setting of Ruth is there's a famine. And not only is there a famine, but they have to travel many distances to try, and we actually don't know why. I know you talked about this last week, like why would you go from Moab to Bethlehem during a famine? And I think part of the answer might be in just you need hope and desperation. And when I'm reading this text with students, or like I invite people to think about times when they truly experienced real hunger, and for a lot they never have, and if they have, it's been by choice, which is not the reality of a lot of people today. And so a time when you really experience hunger, and here, and I think it's verse 14, you see a really a reversal of that situation where it's a terrible famine right now and there's nothing to eat. And this is, again, an economy where they don't have the stores of wealth that we do now, that the only protections from famine, a silo will last you so long.
Right.
And, you have quadrupeds, but those will last you so long, but you don't have savings because you don't have the stores of wealth. And if you have multiple years of drought or pestilence, then that famine will be extra severe. And so the idea that in the midst of this famine, there's abundance provided. And I think it's so, narratives are so laconic and concise, but this is a little bit redundant. Just what she eats, how much, and the fact that she is fully satisfied and there is some left over. And so you'll understand from certain communities that experience food shortage, there are often natural tendencies. When you have the chance to eat, you eat. And so you need, because you don't know when your next meal will come. And so you have this abundant richness that was completely, not predicted in the very beginning of Ruth chapter 1. But also when you have a meal with when you see in, biblical studies texts, people having meals together, it's not just a meal to eat together, but it's an invitation to a social relationship. And you actually see this with Elijah, for example, asking a foreign widow to get water or something to eat. It kind of seems today in our readers like that's kind of rude, but it's in fact an invitation to a socially embedded relationship where you will have this symbiotic. And so what happens after the meal is Elijah will do some miracle for this person. And so it's a really powerful move to not just feed a little bit of gleanings, but to have a full, luxurious, abundant meal together. And it also hints at what's to come. And this is a symbol of, I think, what's later to come with Ruth.
Yeah, and that kind of ties into that larger theme, this kind of symbolic theme throughout the book of fullness and emptiness, and that the book starts with this kind of emptiness of Naomi, that she has been emptied of all of the kind of culturally significant males in her life, but then also has been emptied of her ability to survive and thrive in Moab, and so has to kind of return empty and bitter to Bethlehem, the house of bread, right, which now is full. So like the kind of the interplay of fullness, but in verse 12 that Boaz is noticing kind of the industriousness of Ruth, which some people have pointed out that's a similarity with Proverbs 31, this woman of valor who really does way more than any person could ever do, which there's some issues there too, in terms of people living up to standards and so on. But the idea that Ruth is going above and beyond by trying to support not only her, but support her mother-in-law, who she is pledged to support, but really of a kind of her own free will. She could have turned around and gone back home and it would have been no problem. But then in verse 12, that Boaz is noticing that she has given of herself to fill Naomi. And so may the Lord repay you, or kind of like, may the Lord make you full again, or make you well, get this verb, shalom, this idea that kind of God's gonna give you this full reward because you've emptied of yourself for this other person. And that Boaz notes that as a part of her valor that he'll later describe her with. But then and then during mealtime, he then fills her, right, with his excess, like kind of generosity in a way, but also that she's got more than she needs left over and so on. Like you pointed out, the feeding of 5,000, Chris, but also, Elisha, right, feeds people and has this excess abundance of food, which you can see is kind of the symbol in a way, right, of God's overflowing abundance, like the manna and so on. You got more than you need, so you can just, So this, I think you're right, Roger. I haven't seen it as clearly before. You pointed this out, how Boaz is a stand-in for God, is in a way kind of like a vehicle for God's favor in a way. That's so cool. Thanks.
And the industriousness is, in your Bibles, in your English Bibles, Ruth follows Judges, which makes sense in the days of the Judges. But in the Hebrew Bible, you're both aware that Ruth follows Proverbs 31. So this, when you say Boaz is a man of Chayil, and later on Ruth is declared that woman of valor or woman of, and what's odd, and I'm not sure what to think about, that's often just a military term, a man of valor, like that's used for leaders. But I know it could also stand for someone who's wealthy, which seems to make sense. But I'm thinking about that connection, but maybe I'm overthinking it right now.
Yeah. How Ezra, like the helper, like, that Eve is often translated to be like the helper of Adam in Genesis 2, but really that word is more often like someone who comes to your aid militarily. Where Yahweh is the
God's
Ezra.
a helper.
Right. Yeah. The way that gender inflects the way that we translate some of these terms, that's really interesting.
Right. So for the last 5 minutes, we have about 7 verses left. Really, 17 through 23, Ruth returns to Naomi. She brings some food. Both women are satisfied. Naomi is satisfied, and Roger, thanks for just bringing out that detail of, for people who are experiencing food shortage, the experience of being satisfied is a detail not to be overlooked. But I think this is the part of the story where the most questions maybe arise as to what did Naomi know? What did Ruth know? Did Ruth know whose field she was going to? Did she know Boaz's relationship to Naomi? And so what do you all think about sort of the way that chapter 2 wraps up, or does it wrap up? Does it give us more questions than answers as we think about the roles of these two women and of Boaz in moving the story forward?
Yeah, I'm actually really I'm thinking about this. I don't know here's why I know. Ruth clearly demonstrates agency in chapters 1 and 2, and she's clearly reversing the image of the poor foreign widow who is powerless to someone who asserts for herself from her clinging to Naomi in chapter 1 to the actions in chapter 2 to become to the point where she is now fulfilling her pledge to bring sustenance to Naomi. But I'm kind of at a loss of how much are they aware of what's going on and how much are they just experiencing the grace of God. Ruth 2:2 kind of suggests there's something that she certainly knows, but she doesn't know how that will play off. And I kind of even remember, think through if you are in this place of great death, like even imagine walking from Moab to Bethlehem, just in feeling that hunger as you're walking back and not knowing what's going to go and going there for the first time. If you're Ruth, what are you thinking of, and how you have to be like an ultra optimist to have any positive thoughts on that long journey and to cross the Jordan and to go arrive in Bethlehem. I think about all those feelings that you would have within you. But another thing within all immigrant experience, there's hope, and sometimes that's all you have in desperation. You think, especially today, as of those fleeing politically dangerous situations, why do people walk from Guatemala to America, with children and no food and water? Why would you do that? Because you have hope that generates this response. And so I'm wondering if there's a portion at the end of Ruth 2 that invites us to sit with the wonderment of God's provision without, I knew that there was something, but to experience, I had no idea. Yeah. And I wonder if there's some part that has us kind of just wants to sit with that, just kind of realizing we have all these things, we have protection, we have future gleanings in now, to just kind of fill yourself with that before you get on to Ruth 3 and 4.
Mm.
Yeah. That's a great word.
That's deep. One thing I noticed in 2:19, and this occurs earlier in chapter 2 as well, but Uni Lee points out that nakar, like to be a foreigner, and here, makir, this verb to recognize someone in that participial form, that those are the same roots. Mm-hmm. So to recognize someone and to be a foreigner are actually related terms. And so the idea that if you see someone and you recognize them, they're not a foreigner. So this verb of discerning whether or not when you look at someone, is this a foreigner to me, or is this my neighbor, my kinsperson, this act of recognition, even to recognize someone, you recognize, like to have them pop up in your head that you know them, and then like the expectation, I guess, is that you have obligations to them. But Uni Lee points out that this interplay happens twice in Ruth 2, and then kind of lets that question sit there of, what does this have, like when we see someone, we recognize them. When you look at someone, you notice them. Like, there are lots of people that I don't notice when I go through my life. And who do I choose to notice, and who do I not choose to notice, and who should I notice? That is, who should I recognize as a kinsperson, right? A fellow human. Where does the line between neighbor, and this is some question that's kind of out there, that doesn't often have a clean kind of answer to it sometimes. But that Jesus is getting at with the story of the Good Samaritan. I think the idea of who's the neighbor to this person, but also that we can see in Leviticus 19, which has the gleaning laws about don't withhold this stuff from wandering foreigners. So where do these lines kind of begin and end, and who am I under obligation to recognize? That's I think a pretty live topic in today's political culture of the United States, and something that I think we can kind of bear to sit with and let disturb us a bit, at least me. I mean, that I kind of, what do I focus on? What do I recognize? Who do I recognize as being kind of important, or one of me, right? Part of my crew. And that the kind of real economic, the real material effects that this has on people's lives is something that is terrifying, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
I love where you have us sit, Roger, because it's in verse 20. That's what Naomi says. We can understand that Ruth would go to the biggest field in the neighborhood, and that Boaz was, maybe the big man on campus in the city, right? Like had the wealth, and that would make sense. And then at the end of the story, it's like, oh, it's this guy named Boaz, and Naomi's like, oh, well, that we happen to know it. But in verse 20, whose kindness has not forsaken the living of the dead, that Naomi is able, even who in chapter 1 has renamed herself bitter, is able to say what Boaz did was mediating the kindness of the Lord, and just such a challenge for us and for the people joining us about how we can be the kindness of the Lord for the living and the dead, for foreigners.
A very Romans 8 kind of thing to say, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
You got some New Testament in there, Chris. Look at that.
Yeah, that's right. Twist that in. I get a word about the New Testament every once in a while. That's awesome. Well, I'm mindful of the time that it's now 10:32. We owe Roger 2 minutes of time, and also anybody who's watching with us 2 minutes of their time.
Roger, I'll get you some chicken and beer sometime. We'll make up for it.
Let's make that soon. Actually, like October, the month of October. Let's do it.
Sounds great.
But only 2 minutes worth. Only 2 minutes worth.
That's all I need.
2 minutes are on me, right? Yeah. Split the rest.
Well, Roger, thank you. This has been such a rich conversation at so many levels: the biblical text, the ancient world, the contemporary world, and a good word to leave us with on this Sunday morning, this World Communion Sunday. Brennan, can you remind us of who's coming next week for our study of Ruth chapter 3?
So we have lined up Dr. Judy Fentress-Williams from Virginia Theological Seminary, who's written a commentary on Ruth, and we are looking forward to her take on Ruth 3, the spiciest of all chapters in the Book of Ruth, and definitely the one that we are grateful to have a tried and true scholar of the Book of Ruth to help us navigate. So Dr. Fentress-Williams is an amazing speaker, a lecturer. You can see she's got tons of videos on YouTube of her teaching at Alfred Street Baptist Church in Arlington, Virginia, Alexandria, Virginia. So we're looking forward to having her.
All right. Well, thank you again. Thanks everyone for joining us. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Appreciate it, man.